This video is gonna be a big step forward in this analysis series. We're gonna cover a lot of ground and pass the halfway point. It's probably going to be just 3 major videos after this. The format might shift slightly moving forward. I might be more present, in the sense that, especially in the next videos, I might be going slightly more into my thought process and critique, rather than just my conclusions and explanations on what Vinland Saga is doing. Probably because the later arcs need it more, people get lost. But also, let me introduce myself for once. Hello, my name is Odysseus, and welcome to Two Paradises. My mic just face-planted a few minutes ago, so if there's any audio problems, at least in these sections, you know why. I'm pretty excited about this video, as I am with all my major videos, but this one in particular I feel is important to understand Vinland Saga as a whole. At least how I see it. Sorry for the cuts, but I'm not confident enough yet. We're gonna go through Farmland mainly, also through Prologue and the third arc. I'm sorry, I know the anime hasn't gotten there yet, but I feel like I need to make complete points and I can't compromise. So yeah, these are manga analysis after all. And bear with me on this one, because I'll be talking about a certain topic for a while, and then for the next 10 minutes I'm gonna be talking about something completely different. So don't worry, all ideas will connect meaningfully eventually. I've said before that the beginning of the series, chapters 2 to 4 specifically, lay out everything the series is going to be about. And in that stretch of chapters, one scene clearly stands out as the most important. The escaped slave. Rescued by Thors and Ylva, but with a frail scarred body of a slave and gangrenous limbs, he is unlikely to survive. When asked, he responds in despair that there's nowhere that he can run to. The only thing that awaits him where he came from is a life of suffering. At this point, the slave is in a delirious state. He hallucinates a peaceful scenery and confuses Thors and Helga for his family. And in order to give him comfort, Thors evokes Vinland, a warm, fertile place, isolated, away from slavery and war, inviting the slave to live there with them. Now, Thors knows very well that the slave won't make it. Thors himself isn't really planning to go to Vinland, despite the harsh conditions of Iceland and Greenland. We can see there is a longing in him. He is interested. But whenever he's asked, either by Halfdan or Thorfinn, he says nothing for whatever reason. Maybe he believes it's too big an undertaking, that it's a pipe dream. But all we see is simply uncertainty. Implicitly, the Vinland talked about here is not literal, the real actual Vinland. It's for the sake of the slave, a confirmation of his hallucinations, the peaceful paradise of the only place left he can escape to. There are many paradises in the story. Another one is Avalon, the one Askeladd learned from his mother, an eternal mythical island far away where fairies live and people don't grow old. According to legend, Artorius is still alive there, recovering and preparing to come back and save his people. That's what kept Lydia sane for that long, that false hope. At some point as a kid, he actually believed in it. Askeladd is too much of a pragmatist now, he learned not to rely on these things, but he still has a fondness for the idea. You can interpret what he says about Avalon and Artorius a bunch of ways, certain parts at least. But ultimately, he knows Artorius is dead. There's nothing more to the everlasting paradise of Avalon than that. Some of the most present paradises in the story at that time period, of course, are going to be the religious ones, with Christianity and Norse paganism, heaven and Valhalla. Anne is a young God-fearing Christian girl living in a small village in Mercia with her Christian family. She feels guilty because she gave in to temptation and stole a ring she liked, afraid that, like her father warned, she'll go to hell where demons will torment her for eternity. After Askeladd's band attacks and she ends up the only survivor, Anne tries to talk to God, trying to make sense of what happened. To her, the fact that she's the only one still alive means God rejected her from heaven and she's left to live in hell where the demons lurk. She sees her heart racing when the villagers are killed as proof of her sin, her wrongness in God's eyes, conflating it with the reason her heart raced when stealing the ring. While the Christians are promised heaven for leading a life avoiding sin, the Vikings are awarded an afterlife for, from a Christian perspective, absolute defiance to God. In each of these cases, these paradises, Avalon, Heaven, Valhalla, Vinland, are not a hope for a better future, for a better life. They're a desperate escape from suffering, or more precisely, they're a death. depending on every person's religion or life experiences, afterlives and placating sentiments about death vary, but cold hard reality is the same hell for everyone. Death starts to feel easier and easier to hope for than life. It's at least somewhere that's not here. The Christians are taught to endure everything, the harsh conditions and hard work, even being robbed and killed, but they have that appeasement. If they endure all the suffering, after they die, they'll get to live in eternity in heaven, while the people that tormented them, they'll finally get their just desserts. The Norse are taught to see the harshness of the world as an opportunity, a challenge or a game. If life is torture, they'd rather be the torturers, and if it's that terrible anyways, it's worth risking or shortening it if it means they can gain at least some control over it, get some enjoyment out of it. Even if they fail, they'll still go to Valhalla after death that way. Endure, accept, partake, perpetuate. So no one rejects the state of the world, no one rebels and tries to change it. Askeladd understood when his mother was about to be killed that waiting for Artorius was no use. Someone has to do something, and it won't be a hero or a god, it will have to be an imperfect human. Now, these ways people cope with reality are not inherently tied with religion. These two religions are just huge cultural presences perfectly in line with the sentiments the story is trying to communicate. The purpose is not critique on religion, it's using religion to make a beneficial for the story observation with a lot of merit to it. Vinland never sets out to critique religion. It uses it to add some flair to certain themes as a way to, through the historical setting, get characters wrapped up in those themes, and it uses what I'd say is the closely connected allegory in those religions. Also pointing out the fact that the ideas the story discusses are ones the human mind has always been interested in. It again gives merit to the discussion. Vinland cares about effects religion can have on people. Specifically, it does not like afterlives. It sees them as a potential distraction, a reason to not look at reality. Okay, so someone has to do something. But what do you do? How do you make a difference? Let's talk about Canute. Actually, let's first rip his character a new one, cause I think he has the most problems out of any character in the series. I even find this section difficult to structure because of the info I'm given for him and the order of it in the story. Something doesn't click. It's gonna be an exercise in explaining what works, what doesn't for me, and why. So when he comes into the story, we don't immediately get a lot. We hear about him from others. Basically that he's not cut out for war and he wouldn't make a great leader. We first get proper characterization in the whale section, and mainly it's that he's not very driven, he's weak-willed and kinda shy. The justification for that is that he lived in an environment with a lot of spicy political intrigue and he learned not to stand out. He's very afraid of making mistakes as a prince. We see he acts very meekly, his voice trembles, he freezes in crowds, he hides behind Ragnar, cowers in front of Thorfinn. We are also told he hates needless violence and he occasionally acts spoiled with a touch of royal arrogance. Okay, I'm going a bit slow, but you know where this is going. Is the sudden change justified? I'm trying to lay the foundation and see if everything fits together. This is a particularly unfortunate writing flaw. I'm not gonna be lenient on it. For a series with change as a prominent theme, failing to write change convincingly sticks out, even if that's not the focus with Canute. First of all, he has to be really careful when he speaks. It has to be worthy of the Danish royal line. Ragnar, never mind the international negotiations, go catch me that falcon there. First words spoken by Canute, by the way. The most out-of-character piece of dialogue he has. It immediately gives the impression of an unserious person that doesn't care. Anyway, jumping a bit to the Mercia section, and suddenly, no more Canute awkwardness, no stutter in his talking, converses like a normal person with a hint of royalty. He even blows up at Willibald. He feels different, and I'd accept it if his behavior in the whale section wasn't that extreme. He couldn't even talk, he hid behind Ragnar like a child. A single small scene with Thorfinn and the fact that off the pages he did travel with Vikings for maybe a couple of weeks isn't really enough to justify this change, yet it feels like that's what was intended. Or alternatively, his character didn't change, but it's just only scenarios that he's more confident on, and we just happen to not stumble upon something that would show his awkward side. But you actually do want him to have some gradual change if you don't want to make the big scene later more jarring. And it's gonna be jarring already because you started characterizing here, and in less than 3 volumes and like 2 months at most in the story, you want to get him there. Not impossible if you handle it well and give a lot of attention to the character, but Canute's not even a big focus in these 2 to 3 volumes. That's part of the problem. Okay, you want Canute to feel weak-willed to do your dumb subversion of appearances, and the chick must leave the nest stuff to get to Ragnar's death, but as a potential future leader, standards are already high. You don't need to make him this dysfunctional for the character arc and the plot to work. It's simply too extreme a start. Change that a bit and it would work so much better for no cost. This is generally the big problem. The others are closer to nitpicks despite how long I'll talk about them. Also, as someone who has supposedly witnessed murders in his home growing up, I don't think he should be characterized. The result of that shouldn't manifest like a typical socially awkward teenager. If that aspect of his character was treated with more care and seriousness, maybe I'd feel that the reasons he gives here, being afraid of his father's judgment, is actually the real reason, as it should be, and not just excuses. They're not, I think, but that's how it feels. The tone does mess with the intent. Also, did you know Canute is actually relatively down to earth for a prince? He even occasionally does servant work, he cooks for himself. Ragnar, catch me that falcon, I wanna eat bird for dinner tonight. Next, Canute is supposed to dislike violence and be empathetic. I think. It matters for his eventual motivations. It's what makes him different from the rest of the Norse, and a part of that is what Askeladd values in him. So when all the villagers are rounded up and are about to be massacred, Canute is playing with his hair-looking board. God damn it, Canute, please get in character. Say something, make an appropriate expression. Next day, Willibald is having a crisis of faith for the very understandable reasons of the killing of 62 innocent villagers. Canute proceeds to shut him up because of his dad issues. Like, there's a chance that Canute, while having a distaste for violence, he is desensitized. Both make total sense with what he has lived through and his status. But the story maybe should sell me on Canute being genuinely sympathetic to the suffering of other people, because I think the motivations for his eventual goal benefit from not being purely because of his own personal trauma. I believe that devalues it to some extent. That one body double that Canute showed remorse for has to pull so much weight, and so when Canute reacts like that, it feels a little bit performative from him, which is a thing with Canute, and for other parts of his character it definitely works. But for this, you could see all this as a cool, consistent, realistic detail of his characterization. I guess it could be a matter of preference. I'm getting somewhat won over myself talking about it, but it could have been better for the story if his empathy and distaste for violence felt more genuine, more present. This reaction is awful either way though. All that being said, after the raid, Canute's character finds his footing. 90% of the problems with his character, I believe, are in the first volume he's in the story. They have an effect on him even later, but from here on out, he's well written and consistently written. So Canute mainly feels his father doesn't care about him, or even that he's a burden to him. Sweyn leaving him to hold the siege on London is almost treating him like he's expendable. In reality, he's even less than that, but Canute doesn't know about it. I mean, he has suspicions, but Ragnar tries to convince him the relationship is salvageable, so Ragnar hasn't told him and never got the chance as he dies right after. Ragnar knows because he made plans with Gunnar for Canute to escape to Norway, which Gunnar tells to Canute like he knows? I'm just gonna assume that Gunnar assumes Canute knows, and Canute understood instantly what must have been planned for him, and I'm not gonna be overly harsh, I do buy that. Canute is very religious, and the rejection of the paternal relationship between God and humans is both deeply unpleasant as a Christian and also conjures painful suspicions about the reality of his relationship with his biological father. The first of Willibald's heresies that will shake Canute. Now Willibald, of course, the drunk priest that seeks love but has trouble putting exactly what it is into words. He gets really excited at Thor's story because Thor exhibits traits very close to the love he seeks. I like to think the idea of a warrior that fights trying not to hurt his enemies directly inspired Willibald to act when the raid on the village happens. He decided he had to do something, and in his knowledge, he completely failed. He couldn't change anything. Willibald turns more nihilistic after this. He begins to doubt God's love. After all, why would he set for them trials to suffer through? Trials which are impossible for them to pass because of their inherent weakness. Has he completely abandoned them? After losing Ragnar, Canute is in a very fragile emotional state. He's left to mull over his relationship with Sweyn and Father in Heaven. Those are the only things of substance he thinks he has left, and they don't look very promising. Canute's big moment sadly suffers from his early characterization. The first couple of pages where he snaps and talks about sanity and the meaning of death and the meaning of life makes me cringe a little. Like, who the fuck do you think you are? He just immediately hums it up. Again, it feels slightly performative because what was his character, doesn't naturally talk like this. It feels like he does this intentionally, calculatedly. Instead of it feeling earnest and genuine, it's like Canute is being a drama queen. Either that or the author's hand being revealed. Pick your poison. And after this, especially in Farmland, being a king, his appearance in front of his vassals mattering, some performativeness there is expected, it's good. And with him being an antagonist in a position of power, motives into question, it makes him a bit less trustworthy to the audience. It works there. But here it should be his heart bared open, no filters. So I need to get through that initial impact of it. The rest of the scene is still great. It's not that bad in the manga, the anime tried to own it. It hammed it up even more. It didn't work. It becomes so much more jarring because of the super sudden change in voice acting. Canute right before sounded way more frail, more like this Canute than I thought reading the manga. His dialogue before the dream always sounded in my head less afraid and more frustrated, annoyed. He's in a suicidal state where he's given up. Oh, can't you just give it a rest? Is there nothing else for you to do? Just be quiet. It just makes more sense to me. Anyway, we can at least move on to the interesting stuff. It starts when Willibald denies Ragnar's love for Canute. It's not really love, he says. What is love? Willibald is talking about Christian love. To love everyone equally. Love your friend, your neighbor, your stranger, and your enemy equally. Just like God loves everyone. I see people often get confused at the concept at this point, which always struck me as odd. Don't you know of this? Maybe because, while I'm not religious, I was raised going in a Christian school, specifically Orthodox teachings. So the concept of this type of love is really familiar to me. Even as a kid, I found it obvious that it would be the core kernel of morality, treating everyone around you well and equally. It's the simplest, hardest part of being good, and the most effective way for a large modern society to function peacefully. And so Ragnar did not love in that sense. He discriminated. To the extent he let 62 people get sacrificed for Canute. And Sweyn discriminated against Canute. He cut out the weaker fruit of the branch in favor of the rest. That's something Canute realizes on his own between Ragnar dying and confronting Thorkel. We never see the process of him understanding what Sweyn planned. So who embodies real love? To Willibald, it is death that makes the most sense. After all, the dead can't hurt anyone. They can't treat unequally. Live humans have wants and needs. They are unable to just love everyone equally. That's impossible. Their existence necessitates taking, either for the few that they love or themselves. Even for basic biological functions, they need to take to exist. Humans are made to hurt each other. The dead only give. They can't kill or steal or complain. And so they are the closest to real love. They are the most moral. Humans are better when they're dead. They're finally complete. By that logic, all inanimate objects and plants and physical phenomena embody real love. They just are, just give, and they don't discriminate. And so the love Canute desires is denied to him. He never even had the chance to love or be loved, by his very nature. Changed forever after the original sin, meaning exiled from paradise, because paradise is a state. Being in paradise means for humans to be complete, be capable of true love, thus achieving the perfect coexistence that is paradise. But they became different, flawed, so they don't exist in paradise anymore. And for Willibald, the only way to get close again to that paradise is death. Baldur's part in the story, even if small, feels really relevant to me. Baldur is a good person, an innocent, loving grandson. Empathetic, he'd rather find peaceful solutions, even if naive. He hates all the violence and conflict of Jomsborg and wants to run away from it. What he is really afraid of, though, is his own suffering, living trapped in that. Deep down, he desires an escape, even if it means the suffering and death of others. Baldur can't help but think of himself, no matter how understandable that thought is. But in the end, he realizes that he's the source of the conflict, indirectly through Floki's discrimination, but the irony is not lost on me. Baldur's hypocrisy of wanting to be rid of conflict, but desiring it when convenient to him. Conflict exists because humans are broken. He doesn't get to escape it when he's broken himself. In the face of all that, he sees only one option left, the one thing that can still be his salvation. In the end, Canute reaches the same conclusion with Willibald. If love is something humans will never get as long as they're alive, because of the nature of their existence, and supposedly God loves humans, why all the tests and trials? Why is he dangling the carrot in front of them and forces them to chase it? Makes them go through all that suffering for something ultimately unattainable. It's like they exist only to be punished. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Canute refuses both the salvation of death offered to him and seeking out God's paradise by trying to overcome his human flaws. Instead, he embraces those flaws. He accepts them. Since they are unchangeable, the only way to find a paradise is as they are. Canute stops hoping for paradise to be given to him and realizes humanity has to create one for themselves. He has been pushed to action. All his life he has been passive, just waiting and praying to be loved, just hoping that things will be fine. But now he has decided to fight, and he'll do that through the conventional means, amassing human power. Canute after this is consistently great. He doesn't come off that strongly either. He doesn't have that anime aura where nothing's gonna go wrong with him because he's perfect and nothing's gonna challenge him. Because that feeling is there in the last sequence, in part because the change is forced. It feels like the story has his back. Later, when they arrive at Gainsborough, Canute is written to make mistakes, and I'll compliment once again Vinland Saga's approach to making people smart. They're smart in different, specific ways. Canute knows politics, he knows how to speak like a king, and it makes complete sense that he would have been trained in that. But he's not really a people's person, in the sense that he doesn't understand people at a deep level. At least not like Askeladd, who has the complete opposite background, which he credits for his ability to read people. When they confront Sweyn, Canute's not really picking up what Sweyn's putting down, and we'll talk about that later too. But he also misjudges how far he should push Sweyn, and Askeladd has to stop him before they lose their heads. Later in the scene, Askeladd is furious when Sweyn talks about his mother being a slave, then tries to play it off like he was scared, and Canute completely buys that. When Canute meets Gunnar, again, he coldly tells him of his brother's death and their new plan to go against Sweyn, and he barely even looks at him. Askeladd was looking though, and he realizes Gunnar is not going to be loyal. Especially if you think about it, since the biggest link between him and Canute was Ragnar, and Canute just offhandedly told him that he's dead. Canute doesn't really see people. Before we move on from Prologue Canute, there's some stuff that needs to be talked about in his talk with Sweyn. Cause apparently he too fought his father for the crown. He even says he did it for the good of the kingdom, that he thought he could make the world better. Until he wore the crown. Cause the crown possesses a will of its own. It has great power, yes, but it is not the king who wills the power, but the crown's own will. The crown commands the king to do but two things, to use power and to gain power. Canute acts sarcastically during most of this exchange and doesn't take Sweyn seriously. He will be different. He will control the crown. Thorfinn in Prologue has been a person who fought for his honor, for what he thought was right, for vengeance. He had a one-track mind, a single purpose with no compromises. And he definitively failed. Even for a person as stubborn as Thorfinn, it's clear that his failure is unsalvageable. So Thorfinn doesn't know what to do now. He can never live up to his own ideals. He has nothing else he cares to fight for, so he just gives up, accepting anything that happens to him. I mean, according to his own values, he deserves whatever happens to him, cause somewhat, despite how physically strong he is, he failed, he was weak in some way. That's what should happen to someone who is a disgrace, and he completely omits Son of Thor from his name, implicitly to not bring more shame upon him. And you know how it goes. He meets Einar, starts to form a bond with him, and grows to understand all the horrible things he did and the victims he ignored. He slowly starts to break out from his apathy. But in the beginning of all that, there is this scene where Thorfinn almost lets himself be killed. Why should he be afraid of death? Does something good come from living? Nothing good has ever happened to him. When Snake arrives and saves him, he makes Thorfinn instinctively react to his attack to prove to him that his body, at least, still wants to live. It's a cheap trick, but it does get Thorfinn's mind thinking. Do I want to live? What would I gain from living? On the hillside, Drear the fir tree dies, all bootless its needles and bark. It is like a man whom no one loves. Why should his life be long? What do workers gain from their toil? From that point on, Thorfinn is looking for a reason to live. He's ready to absorb everything from his surroundings, develop a new identity, and find a purpose to keep him going. And while that is going on throughout the first third of Farmland, there are various other characters in the farm with their own arcs and perspectives, furthering the themes of the series in their own way. For the purposes of this analysis, we will go through specific ones. Fox is the one that almost killed Thorfinn. He wants Olmar to kill a slave to get over his self-worth issues, to curry favor with the Ketil family mostly. His reasoning is that killing gives you confidence. It reveals the weakness in others. It makes you less afraid of others, a sense of control, security, power over others as a way to find peace of mind. Never mind that he actually contradicts himself later with Thorfinn. All humans are afraid of death, you say. I thought power helps you to not be afraid of others. And there's not a distinction between others and death, by the way. He is the trader of death here, a human. One thing I love how the story handles in this arc is, well, slavery. You'd think it would be obvious the story would nail that aspect in the slave arc, but the initial setup looks particularly ill-conceived. Thorfinn and Einar get bought by a friendly master that lets them earn their freedom, they make lots of friends, some very influential in the farm, and it's the arc where Thorfinn's life takes a turn for the better. It's good for him, it's like therapy. It's so bad if you think about it, but the arc makes it work. They do have some struggles, the farmhands for example, who owe debts and are stated to essentially be half slaves. So when the slaves get good treatment, the farmhands fear for the security of their position in the farm, its power hierarchy. They don't want to feel they're in the bottom with no control, so they bully the slaves to make themselves feel powerful, by making clear the difference between them and the slaves. Still, that alone and the hard work doesn't fix the problem. Thorfinn and Einar still have it too good. At the end of the day, Thorfinn's arc necessitates for his experience in the farm to be relatively good for him. It's the inclusion of Arnheid that makes this all work. Arnheid in the beginning is a person always shown to be smiling and positive, no indication of suffering, no complaints. She always listens to Einar and his non-issues, always a source of happiness for him. But her situation is much worse than him and with no way to earn her freedom. The story executes this contrast immaculately. In his happiest moment, Arnheid is a harsh return to reality. In his lowest moment, sees the twist of the knife, the assertion of what slavery is really like. The juxtaposition between the two experiences make the series' statements about slavery more poignant. Hey, turning a problem into a boon, ideal writing approach. Arnheid is a person that endures. She's passive, accepting her fate and trying to make the most of it. Ketil, I'll try not to spend too much time about him in this section because I've already talked a lot about him in other videos. But he's super important for this analysis, so I'll have to deal with him. He's a really powerful man with control over a lot of people in many ways. People that work for him of their free will, people that have to because of debts, and people that he owns as slaves. His power comes from wealth, and he is terrified of losing it. He hires guards, he lies about being a powerful warrior, he pays exorbitant tributes to the king for protection. He does not like violence at all or hurting people. But he is afraid of people, what they think of him, that they see him as weak. He's very insecure about that, because his social status depends on Norse ideals of what a man and a leader should be, strong and fearless in both mind and body. Ketil only pretends to be a powerful warrior, and in reality he's a coward. All he has is wealth. And that, of course, is a threat to his way of life, the status quo he has achieved. He can't let other people see his weakness. He can't be vulnerable. So, when they have to figure out what to do with the child thieves, even though he empathizes with them and really doesn't want to hurt them, he never talks back to anyone's reasoning, except encouraging already stated merciful solutions. Because talking back might mean indirectly challenging certain Norse societal values, which might reveal his weakness. So he accepts anything the others conclude, and when asked specifics about the decided punishment, he adjusts his response to look strict and ruthless enough. It's the same when it comes to not punishing Thorfinn and Einar after the fight. He needs support from Peter. Alone he can't go against the farmhands, in fear that his decision might not be socially accepted. If others also publicly agree, then it's fine, no need to worry. The only person Ketil allows to see him be vulnerable and honest about who he really is his slave. His way to protect the farm from outside threats we learn from Sverkel. The guards, but more importantly, the promised protection of the king. But Sverkel doesn't like Ketil's approach. Ketil amasses wealth, then realizing how this might make him a big target, he uses it to buy security. More money means more power, more security. But it also means being a bigger target that needs even more security, which requires an even bigger income. It has no end or greater purpose, it's just a loop of Ketil making himself paranoid. Power that demands Ketil to use it and gain more of it. Okay, what is Canute up to? Well, he's fixing his own mess by reconquering England. If he wants to enact change in the world, he needs to be in control of as much as possible. So for now, war is needed. Canute does some things different though. He tries to not distance himself from the distraction he causes. He forbids pillaging, setting a new example. And he uses smarter methods to win his wars. Poison is just better. Why spend so much time and resources in battles when you can do a surgical cut to remove the enemy leader? Plus it means less innocents suffer, it's more ethical. So that's what we see Canute do in Mercia. He uses power, but as a threat, to convince Edric to betray his king, and so the death and destruction that could have been under a worse leader is avoided. Not everyone likes the change Canute brings. Thorkel especially declares that Canute ends it, and his path must be paved by blood and steel. But, in the end of the day, Canute's way is effective. The world hasn't changed yet, but he is to some extent a better alternative. Edric does turn sides and arranges for Ethelred's death in order to protect Mercia, and 2 years later, Canute has him put to death. I want to talk about Thorfinn's dream a bit. It's got a lot going on for it, so let me jump into exactly what I'm here for. It describes exactly this worldview I was talking about. Thorfinn first thinks that he's in Valhalla, but Askeladd corrects him. That would have been much better. This is the real world. A world where everyone is an enemy. It is where Thorfinn used to live. It's more of a state of mind than a place. Thorfinn, in his warrior years, was always hostile to any opposing idea or any person he encountered. He didn't ever think who he was fighting, who they were and why they were fighting. He just knew that he had a motive to kill them and that they were threats to his well-being. That's the biggest step in his development, to try to understand other people. The most important part of him breaking out of his apathy. This far in Farmland, Thorfinn has been completely passive. That defined him, and it was simply because of uncertainty. But after the dream, it becomes a conviction. That's how Thorfinn thinks he should live. He vows not to ever hurt someone again. While Canute rejects the impossible trials God has imposed on humanity in favor of a more viable compromise, Thorfinn accepts the challenge. Like Thor's, his path to paradise is that perfection that is seemingly antithetical to human nature. Einar doesn't really get it, but respects Thorfinn's decision. Einar has more the perspective of a victim. As opposed to Thorfinn, he has a feeling of catharsis after winning the fight, finally getting a win over his oppressors. In the next phase of the arc, we time skip forward to see Canute, now King of England, visiting his brother Harald in Jelling. Harald ended up in control of Denmark after the death of Sweyn, and Canute wants that control. This section was at points a bit confusing on my multiple rereads, but eventually I think I found out what the intent probably is. I quite like it. Canute poisons Harald to take the crown of Denmark. The two brothers were always on good terms, but Canute still believes it is necessary. He won't trust Harald to work together with him towards the utopia he wants because he can't afford to trust. There's still a chance that there will be disagreements and ensuing conflict. One life isn't worth the risk. You know what? Fine. Understandable. But what Sweyn accuses Canute of is ambition. He wants power not for any noble goal but for himself. This is false. Canute is actually genuine. There's no arguing against that, seeing what the story does with him. I wouldn't blame anyone for misunderstanding this though. Sweyn's head here is not actual Sweyn. It's Canute's mind's projection of what he believes Sweyn is. Back in Prologue, Canute wasn't really understanding him. Canute probably sees Sweyn as a basic power corrupts case, that after he saw what he could achieve with the power of the crown, he started using it for personal gain. A weak-willed man that couldn't control the crown. So here, the person that Canute thinks Sweyn was accuses him of what he fell victim to, ambition. In the next scene, Canute proceeds to reassert his selfless motives and that killing Harald was in service to them. He is being honest. Vinland tackles power corrupts at a deeper level. It addresses the basic understanding of it here and subverts it. No, that's not it. The curse of the crown we're dealing with is different. That's what the final line of the chapter is. So this is it, nothing to it. Because Canute is arrogant and underestimated Sweyn, he remains ignorant of what is happening to him, thinking he is not affected by the crown's will. Another interesting thing here is how Canute grows distrustful and paranoid. After how much poison he used, he is keenly aware of the danger it poses. Wielding power makes him more afraid. He says Sweyn is the only person he can speak to freely. That's not really even a different person. After he becomes king of both countries, Canute starts to run into some problems. Lack of funding for his occupying force in England, which was paid by English taxes, leading to unrest among the English. So he needs to seize a new source of income in Denmark. Increased taxes seem like a bad idea, especially right after taking the throne. That could lead to a revolt by the Danish people. Cultivating new land is not a solution because it's too slow. So Canute decides expropriation. He'll steal the property of some of his subjects to pay the costs of his army, sacrificing the happiness of a few to the benefit of the many. This is Canute's discrimination. What keeps humanity locked out of heaven is gonna be the basis of Canute's paradise. Gunnar suggests to alternatively just disband the army in England, but Canute doesn't see that as an option. The English don't like their conquerors. Forceful subjugation is necessary. Without his rule being enforced with a precedent of violence, he can't trust the English not to turn against him. A king is a sword. What king in this world can rule without power? Back in the farm, Thorfinn's convictions are about to be challenged when Gardar gets thrown into the mix. Gardar has suffered heavy abuse as a slave. He has physical as well as mental wounds. When he arrives to save Arnheid, he's clearly not in his right mind, and escaping with him doesn't seem smart. Einar wants to fight to help Arnheid, but Thorfinn stops him, and indeed that too seems like it's for the best. Gardar gets captured, and Snake suggests to Arnheid to pretend that this isn't her husband, just a mad runaway slave. In the coming night, Einar is restless. He feels the need to do something about the situation. Even if it leads into a fight, there are times when you have to fight, right, Thorfinn? But Thorfinn doesn't answer, and Arnheid actually shares Thorfinn's stance. In their backstory, Gardar left Arnheid and their son to fight for the sake of profit, against Arnheid's wishes, and that decision led to the death of their son and their enslavement. If Gardar wanted to protect Hjalti, Arnheid says he should have stayed behind. Some things cannot be changed. When it comes to one of those things, it's best to do nothing. Just stay put and wait for the storm to pass. That's how Arnheid deals with hardships. She endures, she accepts, and that's how she'll keep her unborn baby safe. Now Gardar has become the storm. He brings conflict and danger through his decision to fight. He's one who partakes, perpetuates. Arnheid's blaming of Gardar here is, in part, a way to emotionally shield herself. She's doing exactly what Snake told her to. There might actually be something wrong with Gardar, sure, but Arnheid dwells on that and his past mistakes to justify abandoning him to herself. She's trying to stop her guilt from leading her to make bad mistakes. But it's not enough. Even for a hardy woman like Arnheid, humans are not made with that kind of strength. They can't just endure everything. Arnheid needs closure, and while she hasn't really changed her mind, she will at least tend to his wounds. That can't hurt. When she meets Gardar, this is one of my all-time favorite Vinland scenes, by the way. Arnheid doesn't find what she was expecting. It would have been easier if Gardar was the wild animal she saw. The one she convinced herself was all that was left of him. But on his own, Gardar succinctly apologizes for exactly what Arnheid blamed him for, showing deep remorse. All the emotional walls Arnheid put up are now only fueling her guilt. She wanted to abandon him, but because she couldn't face that, she did it by trying to accuse and hate him. She was seeking closure, but only made things worse for herself. Now it's even harder to leave him. But also, she has to think of the baby, whose life she's getting closer to risking by doing this in the first place, because of wishful thinking. No matter what decision Arnheid makes, a person she loves might suffer for it. There's no completely right choice here. Arnheid never should have to make such a choice anyway. So Gardar does. During the night, Einar and Thorfinn stay awake. Thorfinn so he can stop Einar from doing anything reckless. The following conversation is basically a brief recounting of Thorfinn's experience of Norse society. How it functions, why it is that way, how it shaped him, why he doesn't want to be a part of it. The first step is understanding the world around them, because now they want to change it. Thorfinn has decided that just not hurting anyone, just being passive, isn't enough. He has to do something for his atonement to mean anything, for him to have any positive impact in the world. And again, when Thorfinn brings up the idea of building a village, a place without violence, Einar immediately thinks they'd have to protect it through fighting. Thorfinn doesn't believe that fixes the problem though, it defeats the point. And this is a relevant topic, but I'll elaborate more on other videos. When they meet up with Arnheid again after learning of what happened, Einar urges them to act. He can't stand by without doing anything anymore. They'll help Arnheid and Gardar. It is the only choice now. Right, Thorfinn? Thorfinn finally caves in, begrudgingly. Maybe it is the only choice. So they devise a desperate plan to escape. Einar draws off the guests, they get Gardar from under the bed, get him to the cart where Sverkel will lead them out of the farm, and it didn't work. Snake figured them out. Thorfinn is forced to fight to protect Gardar. He breaks the oath. Thorfinn isn't just gonna let Gardar die, and Snake is not gonna argue about it. It's a big moment for Thorfinn's character, but even if painful, it's not a particularly hard choice to make. It obviously is the right thing to do. Thorfinn fails. Fighting didn't work. On top of the fight being totally one-sided, Snake doesn't even need to win, he only needs to get to the cart. Begging for Snake not to kill Gardar doesn't work either. Neither does money. So nothing really worked, for anyone, neither fighting or waiting for the storm to pass. Everyone did their best, tried their hardest, and it didn't get them anywhere. Indecision, recklessness, lack of communication and information, incompatible methods, desperation, one's mistake leading to another's mistake leading to another's mistake. The situation only got worse and worse. What could they have done? Someone has to do something. But what? How does one fix this hell? Einar tries to comfort Thorfinn. He couldn't help it. He did what he needed to. There are times when one has to fight. Thorfinn doesn't even engage with that. He acknowledges that violence is the last resort, but stays focused on what could have been done better, a scenario where no one had to be hurt. Einar says there's nothing Thorfinn could have done. By the time Gardar killed the guests, it was too late. And while he's more right than he knows, what he's suggesting here is for Thorfinn to essentially feel good and morally justified for doing the correct thing when conflict had reached its direst climax, which is extremely narrow-minded. Because Einar comes from a perspective of someone who's tired of being stepped on and being a victim. He wants to deny that from his oppressors, and so fighting back in and of itself is a win, even if there's nothing to be gained, even if it's not the smartest choice. Not that he doesn't want for things to get better, he just doesn't believe they will, not really. So while all this stuff with Arnheid is happening, Einar just feels the need to do something in every step of the way, without really thinking about the consequences. That's not the mindset of someone who's trying to create a better future. Yes, Thorfinn did the right thing, but that's easy to say when you just sat by watching this escalate bit by bit, and only at the very end, after things have gone to shit and it came down to violence, you threw a couple fists and left the outcome to that. You're supposed to try to find the first resort before it comes to the last. It's common sense to address a problem before it becomes one, before the mistakes happen in the first place. Thorfinn doesn't dull himself with appeasement, he doesn't accept anymore. And what could have been the best option here? I don't know, there might actually not have been one, at least from Thorfinn's position. But did he really try hard enough to find it? And was he capable enough? These things require foresight, intelligence and information. One needs to be able to anticipate how their actions will affect the situation and other people. Understanding is the first step to taking the first resort. You need to be able to understand how other people work. Ketil returns from yelling around this time, having to deal with his worst nightmare coming true. His greatest source of protection has turned on him because he made himself too big a target. Canute is coming to steal everything Ketil has built. What can a weak man like him do about it? Seek comfort from Arnheid. He still has that. He learns about what happened from his wife and she unknowingly paints the situation in the way that will rile him up the most. Even though that is what she wants, she doesn't understand how much pressure was on Ketil already. She makes Ketil seem like a soft idiot loser and Arnheid like a calculating manipulator. He feels betrayed as a man, emasculated, and like he let everyone walk all over him. It's beginning to look like all those warnings from our society about how harsh and ruthless a man ought to be, they're starting to ring true now. When Arnheid tries to convince him the baby is his, Ketil of course refuses to believe her. Now more than ever, he has learned that he can't afford to show weakness and leniency. He can't afford to trust. And that was always his mistake with Arnheid. Subjugation through force being the only way you can depend on other people and gain control of your life. The lesson that was drilled into him back when they punished the young thieves has taken a root. The precedent of violence is what enables and maintains order in human coexistence and relationships. And after understanding this, there's only one way to deal with Canute. But let's go back a bit. How could you ever have called this a relationship of trust for Ketil to feel betrayed now? Ketil never had to trust Arnheid. He specifically saw the vulnerability only to her because she was his slave, completely under his control. He only showed his aversion to violence to a person under the precedent of violence. Ketil wanted to find someone who supported him for who he thinks he was, an anchor to attach his identity onto, a person who found value in that identity so he himself could too. But that requires a risk, the leap of faith that is trust, and Ketil was never actually prepared to be vulnerable. So, see, what he relies on for affirmation of the value of being kind and peaceful is not Arnheid, but his own power to subjugate a person. That is the contradiction that led him feeling betrayed. And Ketil doesn't understand that he's doing this. He sees that the Arnheid he has been talking to is a fake, and his conclusion is that he can't risk trusting people and he can only rely on power. The deception, though, wasn't caused by Arnheid, but by Ketil's own power threatening Arnheid into a relationship that is obviously not genuine on her part. Power isolates people. It obfuscates human relationships. It creates the problem while at the same time asserting its own necessity in solving it. So, Ketil beats Arnheid, like the farmhands harass the slaves, like Fox says, to feel confident, to feel powerful. You won't be afraid then, you'll find peace of mind. A man, slave to gold, holds a whip and beats the slave he bought with that gold, as if to claim he is the master, he just doesn't see it for himself. People pick up a sharp stick and start believing they can do anything. We're biologically wired to feel that way, to be fair. Ketil has deluded himself into thinking that he can similarly punish anyone. But no matter how strong one is, how wealthy or how many men he commands, there's always a bigger fish. Fox enjoys the feeling of power that comes from violence. Knowing he's relatively tougher than most makes him feel confident, less afraid, he said. But now, when facing men who are stronger, he's paralyzed by fear. Everyone is afraid of death, after all. In fact, having experienced this from the other side before, the intimate understanding of that position only frightens him more. These men invoked might makes right because it suited their wants at the time. But the world belongs to the strongest, and it's naive to believe that's gonna be you, that you'll always be able to solve things with violence, just cause of your relative power in what you can perceive in your immediate surroundings. So Ketil learns the hard way how it feels to be subjugated, to be stripped of power, to only be hurt more for righteously fighting back. He should have obeyed, but his pride and sense of entitlement got in the way, and he's not the only one who suffered for it. And finally, we've reached Arnheid's death, one of the best segments in the story, and what marks the finale of Thorfinn's development arc in Farmland. First, I think it's important that her death is framed in part as a choice. There's a lot of weight given on her will to stay alive. When Arnheid speaks of death, she is imagining a paradise, her going home to meet her dead family again. Now, this is not an uncommon trope in stories. A lot of times it's used to give a sense of closure and contentment, to make death bittersweet instead of just bitter. In Vinland, given the thematic context, it makes it much worse. It's that convenient dream. Arnheid, faced with all the suffering awaiting her, stops hoping for a better future and gives in to false hallucinations about death. To her, it has become salvation. What is Thorfinn supposed to do? How does he stop her from giving up? One of the reasons this moment really clicks with me is who Arnheid is. She was a person that made the most of the awful situation she was put in, and it didn't manage to change her. She did the best she could for her and the people she loved. She didn't let the fall paralyze her, and she stuck a smile to her face on top of that. She moved forward because she always hoped things could get better. But this is the moment we see the experience has finally broken her. What will I gain by living? Why do I have to live? It's nothing but pain. Thorfinn's own lines from his first encounter with Snake are thrown back at him, made in reverse. Instead of finding a reason to live, Arnheid is realizing she wants nothing of what life has in store for her. But has this journey of reflection and improvement given Thorfinn the answers to the questions that started it? Before he can say anything, Arnheid loses her consciousness, and Thorfinn tries to bring her back to life with a technique he saw his father using to similarly save a slave back in chapter 3. But it doesn't work. In the end, Arnheid dies, with Thorfinn making the Vinland speech above her. But this is not the same with back then. It's not just comfort, but the answer Thorfinn has found. I'll use this dialogue from the aftermath as it is in the manga, cause after extracting and elaborating on the context, it speaks for itself. When Arnheid asked me why do I have to live, I didn't have an answer at first. She had already lost everything more appealing than death. She lost all the things that made her keep living. To her, death was not a source of fear. It was her final salvation, her ultimate peace. So whatever words I could say to tell Arnheid to keep living didn't come to me at first. I want something that transcends death. I want something that I can offer her proudly. A salvation and peace greater than death. Here, in the land of the living. And if it does not exist, I will make it. And that's the difference. Vinland isn't an abstract concept anymore. An idea only offering appeasement. This Vinland Thorfinn is talking about right here is a real place. A real hope with real implications. Thorfinn decided that he needs to do something to make a positive change. And now he has found what form that action will have. Something that marries the path of atonement he needs to walk and his personal want for purpose. Helping himself by helping others. Or vice versa. And Arnheid's death is not the only point in the story that Thorfinn's motivations are directly reinforced in that specific way, through reiteration of that nihilistic perspective in early Farmland. Garm does this as well, but representing an opposite perspective to that of Arnheid. The wolves and sheep, Vikings and Christians, that kind of distinction. Arnheid is someone who passively endures in response to the world's hardships. Garm is one who partakes. The world is drowned in conflict, so might as well give in and enjoy it for what it is. Garm and other Vikings are addicted to that way of living. It's the easiest, the most intense. There's no investment, so nothing to lose. A life in that world is bound to be painful and short already, so its only value is reaching that high. Death could even seem appealing, not so much a thing to fear. Garm is way different than Arnheid and Thorfinn, but his worldview ultimately relies on that same question. What good's a life anyway? That line is not coincidentally placed there. In all that insane rambling that Thorfinn doesn't understand in the least, that line is painfully familiar. Garm and the people he represents are as much victims to the state of the world as anyone. Him and Thorfinn are only enemies in relative terms. In reality, their needs for purpose align. The wedge that drives them apart and makes them fight is the real enemy, and we're talking at the societal level. Closing in on Thorfinn's meeting with Canute, Thorfinn is desperate to test himself and find the first resort after completely failing to make a difference up to that point. His stubbornness here to adhere to his values pushes him to accept the 100 Punches challenge, even though he doesn't really have a plan for negotiating with Canute. It's not stupid that he does this, that is just what he is willing to sacrifice to attempt this. Thorfinn is no negotiating master and he has no leverage. The only thing he can offer is sincerity. If you want others to value input based on your ideals, staying true to those is essential to be perceived as honest and credible. Manipulation and coercion have their moments, but generally, you reap what you sow. You don't get trust in return from those. And Thorfinn's decision to not prove his identity by fighting, aside giving everyone here something to think about, does help him with Canute. First because, by implication through this panel, Canute doesn't want to meet with Thorfinn because he understandably sees him as a threat. Also, cause naturally the young Thorfinn he knows has nothing of value to say, so violence won't change any impressions. And later we'll see how Thorfinn's commitment further affects Canute. First thing Canute does when the topic of the negotiation is breached is lie. That's what his whole plan relies on: manipulation, lying and force, no cooperation. Einar figures him out and goes off on him, very cathartic, but Canute is unfazed. There's a logic to his madness and he knows what he does is for the sake of the greater good. Thorfinn seeks to understand Canute first. That's part of why he wanted to meet him. After all, he was a person with the same goals as the current him. How did he end up like this? Canute is the bigger fish. The biggest, actually. While people like Ketil are naive to think they'll always be the ones on top, Canute is in a position where he can enforce his rule and his justice. He's the most powerful human. But still a human. Not a god. He can't just snap his fingers and solve all the world's problems. God's rules are still absolute. Living beings who have forsaken love are ordained to suffer. To escape from that status quo, to build a paradise devoid of suffering, means rebellion against God and his design. And to do that, human strength must be united, using the fallen humanity's birthright to do so: violence. Vikings are a great representation of the fallen humanity. Conflict and violence is in its nature. There's no use ignoring what makes us flawed, ignoring the most flawed among us. They have to be accounted for. That's what Thorfinn can never do here with his approach. There's no pretense in the story that Thorfinn can change Viking society. all he can do is make life better for a select group of people and inspire a few others to be better. At most find an alternative, better societal structure in isolation. But Canute incorporates Vikings into his plan, and what better way to build a utopia than utilizing the very thing that excluded humans from God's paradise? Turning a problem into a boon, ideal solution to anything. But the main point is, power is essential. In order to unify humanity, Canute has to subjugate it. Violence will exist anyway, just unchecked and chaotic. Canute wants to give it direction and purpose, and with it he will create a better society. The suffering of a few for the benefit of the many. That's the best a mortal man can do. So what is Thorfinn gonna do after Canute refuses? Is there some magical method or technique that is superior? What king in this world can rule without power? Against Canute's full might, what does Thorfinn have that is better? Canute would certainly love to know it. Show him proof of what can tame violence aside violence. Honestly, Canute might be tyrannical and ruthless, but I personally agree with him. At that time, in that world, a good tyrant that can enact some drastic change is kind of the best you can hope for. His ideology for the most part is correct. The story does not fail to realize this. Thorfinn won't judge Canute, he can't. But that's simply not all there is to it. Just like there's more to humanity than simply conflict. So where has Canute gone wrong? Throughout Farmland, Canute has tried to gain absolute control over his territory and his people. His power must be secure in order for his plan to create a utopia to be safe. That's why he's always looking out for threats to snuff out. His brother Harald? Too powerful, too big a variable to leave be. It's much safer to kill him. The English? He's their conqueror. Without an occupying army enforcing his rule, they might turn against him again. Can't risk that, so the army stays there, and this whole expropriation plan forms. Edric, who switched to Canute's side, sure has experience betraying and poisoning his king. Execute him. Even though he forced him to do that. But I guess wielding power makes you intimately familiar with its effectiveness. The one who used poison the most becomes the most afraid of it. Doesn't take that much to kill a king, it turns out. All those armies are useless in protecting you against poison. Any of your common servants could prove to be your deadliest enemy, cause, after all, you are still a human, and not a god. And even if you are at the top of humanity, any other human has the potential to reach you. Anyone could be a threat and an enemy. Thorfinn too. Not only that, the position you have put yourself in through your search for control and security has put a target on your back. The paranoia is to some extent warranted. Furthermore, and maybe most importantly, it even hinders your ability to recognize threat. What is Canute ever gonna see aside the faces of loyal servants and trusted allies, at least while his head is still on his shoulders? No enemy in his reach is realistically going to present themselves as one. Your power forces everyone to act the same towards you. I'd imagine Edric was really doomed from the start then. There's nothing he could do as Canute's subject to prove his trustworthiness. As soon as Canute started to suspect, it was over. A relationship of mutual trust cannot be formed with such a power dynamic. And as Canute is the most powerful, Canute cannot trust anyone, aside an imaginary equal. He becomes isolated. He was never an Askeladd, as I've established, but now Canute only sees people as responsibilities and threats, wolves and sheep. That really important leadership trait of being able to understand people is lost. Power obfuscates human relationships. This is what the will of the crown is. This is what power does. It creates a problem, then presents itself as the only solution, only to further feed into the problem in the long term, leading the bearer of the crown into a loop of having to gain and use power. So it's logical for Canute to start suspecting Thorfinn, and on top of that he tries to corner him into manifesting that potential threat Canute sees in him. He starts building up the danger Thorfinn poses in his mind, Swain pushes Canute to kill him before he acts. Case in point, the will of the crown is trying to prove the necessity of power by prodding to create a problem and framing it like it always existed on its own. Treating potential enemies as enemies might make them actual enemies. But Thorfinn, being completely committed to his values, doesn't bite, and Canute's illusions are completely shattered. This whole thought process would now look foolishly wrong. He was about to kill someone for nothing. How does this help his utopia? Whom else has he killed for no true reason? What would happen if Canute continues like this? The reality is that Canute would never have reached anything significantly different than the rule he supplanted. The status quo of the world exists because of a certain logic. It's an equilibrium. There are powerful forces that support and maintain it. You need power to enforce an order and to protect yourself from others that would use power against you for the exact same reasons. Canute isn't the only leader that has been pushed to this way of thinking and contributed to the same status quo. Even if he doesn't want to see it, there's the implication Sweyn was exactly like Canute in his youth. People, most of all, are afraid. They want to be certain of the future. They want security and peace of mind. That is their most powerful drive. And it's what leads them to the allure of power. And the chase to be the most powerful is what makes the world hell, which of course then makes people more fearful, giving them incentive to seek security through power. That's the balance of the world. Ultimately, power offers no guarantees for a human. You'll never have enough power to definitively rise above everyone else. Other humans will always have the reach and the potential to hurt you. With Canute's plan to build a paradise depending on him exerting absolute control, that's essentially a sentence of forever fighting the people you've sworn to help, making enemies out of them because they're technically potentially still threats. A better world can't be born from this. What can you do then? How do you break out of this equilibrium? Accept human vulnerability. Can't fully escape it anyway. Take a risk to trust others. If uniting human strength is necessary to fight against God's rules and power alone doesn't cut it, peaceful cooperation is all you can hope for. There's no peaceful cooperation without trust. There's no trust without vulnerability. There's no change without that risk. It's difficult to do, I know, to loosen your grip on the reins of power. Leave your fate to another's hands for a change. It's almost like placing your arm on a wolf's jaw and hoping it won't bite. But if a better world is your goal, you don't have any other option. And mind you, that doesn't make Canute's whole ideology wrong. It doesn't mean you have to completely abandon power. If we were able to do that and completely peacefully coexist in harmony, that would be God's paradise. And that's a tall task, especially at the time, or present time. No, power is still necessary. Sometimes a few have to suffer for the benefit of the many. But for the world you are preserving without power to be any better than what it used to be, you need to at least take some risks. That is undeniable. Thorfinn, through his sincerity alone, has proven Canute wrong. He stayed true to his values and consequently earned Canute's trust. And Canute takes his mistake and the criticisms to heart, reconsidering his plans. Who else has Canute misjudged aside Thorfinn? Too quick to label them as enemies and taking drastic measures as a result. So Canute cancels his plans to steal farms from within Denmark to fund his occupying force. Instead, he decides to trust the English people not to rebel against him after he pulls his forces from England. By abandoning military power, Canute changed the balance of conqueror and conquered. The English recognized the trust that Canute had placed in them, and Canute realized the English had recognized him as their proper king. Gunnar was right all along. Better solutions do exist, they're just difficult to find. They require intelligence and understanding and the guts to take the right risks, and for that to see the illusion of certainty power offers for what it is. Ironically, Ketil took a step in the right direction by easing up and letting go some control over his slaves, giving them the ability to free themselves, the freedom to tackle their work how they want, and the chance of employment. He managed to create positive relationships and more effective workers. In the end, Willibald was wrong. Humans aren't fundamentally toxic to one another. A good human is not a dead one. People shouldn't ever look to death for salvation and paradise. He was just through some rough experiences and his mind turned to dark thoughts. It's not even really that hard to come up with an example disproving him. Like, say, a pot of mutton stew. The shepherd raises the sheep and the blacksmith fashions the pot. There can't be mutton stew if both these men do not see eye to eye. They depend on one another. They both benefit from one another's existence and their alliance and friendship. Power isn't needed. One doesn't need to steal or hurt the other. While Willibald boiled human activity down to either exclusively hurtful or alternatively complete non-action, essentially death. Canute and Thorfinn's agreement is just like that. In Canute's paradise, a few will have to suffer for the benefit of the many, and the land of peace Thorfinn will try to create is for the sake of those few. Their two visions complete each other. They're not opposing as they seem ideologically. At least as long as Canute doesn't spiral out of control with the curse of the crown.
Humans are capable of conflict and violence, but they are also capable of peaceful cooperation. Both of these are in our nature, even if they are antithetical. And also, not every human exhibits both at the same time or in the same magnitude. Humans differ and humans can change, they're malleable. Thorfinn is proof. And that's because what's really in our nature is just the potential to be good or bad. No one is fated to hurt or be hurt from the moment they're born. That depends mostly to environmental factors. We can nurture healthy and discourage unhealthy behaviors through societal systems, and societies can be managed and adjusted. They are not static. The story taking place 1,000 years ago gives us valuable perspective to that. It was designed that way. Point is, people can change both individually and as a whole. We are not doomed to be victims of our nature. It can even be said that we're primarily social animals. We crave human connection most of all. We are meant to enrich one another. Young was I once and wandered alone, and not of the road I knew. Rich did I feel when a comrade I found, for man is man's delight. At the end of the day, the path that allows people to form meaningful relationships is bound to be the most fulfilling. Isolating yourself just feels miserable. TLDR, Vinland Saga thesis statement. Don't accept the cityness of the world and don't give up on it. Our nature doesn't control us, we can account for it. Contribute in your own way. Someone has to do something, but it can't be just anything. Simply not causing harm won't change anything, and neither will recklessly raging against it. Smart solutions are needed, and to find them first and foremost, you need to understand people, both their weaknesses and strengths. Don't let power cloud your judgment and get distracted by promises of easy shortcuts that will let you bypass the agency of others. You will need to take informed risks and trust people. This, I feel, is the broader statement Vinland Saga makes here. Beyond Farmland, this is of course reiterated and elaborated upon. But also Vinland cares about getting into the nitty-gritty of it. All the talks about grand ideas and allegories about God and paradises and death and mutton stew, they're fine and all, but they need to be based on practical real-life examples. A more detailed examination of society, what makes people tick, how are they pushed to act, stuff like pride, justice, gender roles, honor. This video had its fair share too, but I would point to the Thorkel and the Appeal of War video for more of that stuff. People get a little bit lost after Farmland, but it's a pretty natural continuation. Vinland Saga starts from an unchallenged might is right Norse society and slowly pushes towards a completely antithetical ideal. God's paradise, that perfect coexistence without the need of power. It's the challenge Thorfinn has accepted. The first step after Prologue is to force a concession from that absolute might is right mentality through Canute. It can't all be power for things to get better. But Norse society is not ready for too drastic a change, even if such a change could potentially be feasible. So we set our sights on Vinland to push the envelope one step further than the limited compromise we see in Farmland. It's a worthwhile direction to explore. And that's why Canute is not a main character anymore. It makes sense, people, he served his purpose.
So, as you can see, this was an especially fun video to make, and especially annoying. This thing gets hot. And it was also a pain to fit right. And also I gotta remember my lines, and I gotta get them in fewer takes right. And also English, I'm still not very good at that. And all that stuff is part of why I took so long for this. Sorry, but it was a pain. I'm gonna try to wear this in the other major reviews, but we'll see. Try to incorporate this more into the videos. But also, if you have any questions about anything in the video, I know I go fast, I try to be concise, I try to not repeat myself, so I understand if some stuff you missed. Do comment down below. Except if it is about Thorfinn, his motivation specifically, I'm gonna make a shorter video about that after this, because I realized in the making of this video that, you know what, I'll explain in that video. Also, maybe I'll put some pictures of the full cosplay here. I can't even show the boots like this. Anyway, that's about it. Thank you very much, and no, I will not be covering the theatrical play. I cannot be bothered with that. Thank you and goodbye.